The morning air hung thick with humidity as Lieutenant Commander Percival Thornhill squinted through his binoculars. The Strait of Malacca stretched before him, the waters deceptively calm on this February 3rd, 1942. Singapore Harbour, once a proud jewel of British maritime power in the Pacific, now trembled under the shadow of approaching Japanese bombers. Through the morning haze, he could see them, 23 transport ships, carrying over 4,000 Allied troops and critical supplies, sitting exposed in the harbour channel, defenceless, waiting. The radio crackled with frantic orders. All vessels maintain position. Air raid imminent. Follow established protocol. Thornhill's weathered hands gripped the railing of the harbour master's observation post. Sweat beaded on his forehead, not from the tropical heat but from the terrible mathematics unfolding in his mind. Standard protocol meant the convoy would scatter, predictably, exactly as the Japanese Air Command anticipated. He had seen the results of this tactic 3 times before. Sunken transports, oil fires spreading across the water, and the terrible, unforgettable sight of men struggling to swim through burning fuel. His throat tightened as he glanced at the order paper in his hand, then back to the vulnerable ships. 23 years as a harbour pilot in these waters, 23 years of following procedure to the letter. "Sir?" His young assistant looked at him questioningly, radio handset extended. "Command wants confirmation of dispersal orders." Thornhill didn't take the radio. Instead, he reached for the field telephone connecting directly to the harbour tugboats. His voice was steady but quiet. "This is Thornhill. Ignore dispersal orders. Gather every available coal-burning vessel. Immediate implementation of Plan 17. The assistant's face drained of colour. "Sir, that's directly against—" "I know exactly what it's against," Thornhill cut him off, already moving toward the harbour launch. "And I know exactly what's at stake." No one in Singapore Harbour that morning knew that one harbour pilot's defiance would create a tactical innovation so effective it would be classified for decades after the war ended. Percival Thornhill was born on August 12, 1897, in the small coastal town of Hartlepool, England. The son of a merchant sailor and a schoolteacher, young Percival grew up with the rhythm of tides dictating the pattern of his days. His father, often away at sea for months at a time, would return with stories of distant ports and treacherous passages navigated only by the skill of harbour pilots who guided vessels through dangerous waters. "They're the true masters of the sea," his father would say, pointing out the window of their modest home toward the harbour. Not the captains with their fancy uniforms, but the pilots who know every rock, every current, every mood of their waters. The family home overlooked the busy Hartlepool docks, and young Percival spent countless hours watching the comings and goings of ships, memorizing their signals and learning to read the weather from cloud formations and water patterns. By age 12, he could identify dozens of vessel types by silhouette alone and had compiled a handwritten journal of tide patterns that impressed even veteran sailors. His mother, determined her son would have more opportunities than the typical dockworker's child, insisted on rigid schooling with a particular focus on mathematics and navigation. Though Percival struggled with formal education, preferring the practical knowledge of the docks, his natural aptitude for spatial reasoning and fluid dynamics became evident when applied to maritime challenges. At 16, against his mother's wishes but with his father's quiet blessing, Percival left school to apprentice with the Hartlepool Harbour Authority. The First World War had just begun, creating a desperate need for skilled maritime workers as experienced men left for military service. What would normally have been a competitive position became available to the eager teenager with remarkable local knowledge. His mentor, Harbour Master James Whitcroft, initially dismissed the boy as too young and inexperienced. "Books and watching from shore won't prepare you for what happens when 30,000 tons of steel needs guidance through a narrow channel in fog," he warned. But Whitcroft soon discovered Percival's unusual talent, an almost supernatural sense of how water, weather, and vessels interacted. The boy could predict how a ship would respond to currents before the captain felt the first pull. Those early years proved formative. Percival helped guide military transports and supply ships through the treacherous North Sea during wartime conditions, often under blackout restrictions with German U-boats patrolling nearby waters. He developed techniques for using natural phenomena, fog banks, tide flows, and coastal features to provide concealment for vulnerable vessels. By war's end, despite his youth, Percival had earned a reputation for innovative problem-solving under pressure. When conventional approaches failed, he found unconventional solutions. "The sea doesn't care about your rulebook," he often told junior pilots. "It follows its own laws, and so must we." This independence of thought did not always endear him to superiors, who noted his troubling tendency toward improvisation in official reports. Yet results spoke for themselves. Not a single vessel under his guidance was lost during those dangerous wartime years. After the war, seeking greater challenges and advancement opportunities closed to him in tradition-bound Britain, Percival accepted a position with the Straits Settlements Harbour Authority in Singapore in 1925. The bustling port, strategically positioned between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, handled vessels from around the world, navigating the complex channels and changing weather patterns of the South China Sea. For 15 years he mastered these new waters, earning respect among international shipping companies for his skillful handling of the largest vessels through difficult passages. He married Eleanor Chen, the daughter of a prominent Chinese-Singaporean shipping merchant, and their home became a gathering place for maritime professionals from across Southeast Asia. Little did he know that the skills developed over decades of peacetime service would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. By 1940, as war clouds gathered over the Pacific, Thornhill had been promoted to lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy Reserve, overseeing pilot operations for military vessels throughout the Singapore Naval Base, the largest British naval facility in Asia. He had no idea that soon those instincts for unconventional solutions would be all that stood between thousands of Allied soldiers and certain death. By late 1941, Singapore stood as Britain's last major stronghold in Southeast Asia. Often called the Gibraltar of the East, the island fortress was considered impregnable, a myth that would soon be shattered by the rapid Japanese advance down the Malay Peninsula. The strategic importance of Singapore could not be overstated. Positioned at the narrowest point of the Strait of Malacca, it controlled the maritime choke point between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Nearly 40% of world shipping passed through these waters. The massive naval base on the northern shore of Singapore Island housed repair facilities, fuel depots, and administrative headquarters for Britain's Far East Fleet. As the year drew to a close, the situation in the Pacific deteriorated with shocking speed. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor. Simultaneously, Japanese invasion forces landed on the northern Malay Peninsula near the Thai border. The Philippines came under attack. Hong Kong was besieged. Within days, the entire Pacific was engulfed in conflict. The British Far East Command, led by Air Chief Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, had long assumed that any attack on Singapore would come from the sea. Against the massive coastal guns and naval defenses that protected the southern approaches to the island, military planners considered the dense jungle of the Malay Peninsula an impenetrable natural barrier to the north. This proved a catastrophic miscalculation. Japanese forces under Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding the 25th Army, advanced down the peninsula with remarkable speed. Moving on bicycles through jungle paths, Japanese soldiers outflanked and isolated British defensive positions. The invaders captured British fuel dumps intact, allowing their mechanized units to maintain momentum. The Royal Air Force, severely outnumbered, lost control of the skies within the first week of fighting. By January 15, 1942, Japanese forces had reached Johor, the southernmost state of the Malay Peninsula, directly across the narrow strait from Singapore Island. The situation was becoming desperate. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commanding Commonwealth forces in Singapore, faced impossible choices. Reinforcements were being diverted to other theatres. Critical supplies dwindled. Remaining aircraft numbered fewer than 30 operational planes. During this chaotic period, Singapore Harbour became the lifeline for both military supplies and the evacuation of civilians and wounded soldiers. Convoys arrived carrying ammunition, food, and occasionally reinforcements, then departed loaded with evacuees. These convoys faced growing danger with each passing day, as Japanese air superiority tightened around the besieged island. The Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, operating from captured airfields in Malaya, conducted regular bombing raids on Singapore Harbour. Their preferred tactic involved striking when convoys were most vulnerable, either arriving through the narrow eastern approaches or departing through the western channels. Standard British protocol required ships to disperse during air raids, spreading out to minimize losses from individual bomb hits. This dispersal pattern, however, made each vessel an isolated target, easier for Japanese bombers to attack methodically. The Japanese 22nd Air Flotilla, commanded by Admiral Sadaichi Matsunaga, had developed highly effective anti-shipping tactics during operations in China. Their bomber pilots specialized in the destruction of merchant vessels and transports, attacking from multiple angles to overwhelm shipboard anti-aircraft defenses. Between January 20th and February 1st, 1942, these air attacks had sunk 17 Allied vessels in Singapore waters. At the Harbour Master's office, Lieutenant Commander Thornhill witnessed the results of these attacks firsthand. Standard defensive measures were failing catastrophically. Naval escort vessels were too few to provide adequate protection. Anti-aircraft batteries on shore could not extend their coverage to the critical shipping channels. The dispersal protocol, textbook naval doctrine, was resulting in precisely the isolated targets Japanese pilots preferred. As the military situation deteriorated, command structures began to fragment. Communications between Army headquarters at Fort Canning, the Naval Base Command, and the civilian Harbour Authority became increasingly disjointed. Contradictory orders were common. In this environment of confusion, harbour pilots like Thornhill, with their intimate knowledge of local waters, became increasingly important to operational planning. By early February, Singapore's civilian population faced growing panic. Air raids occurred day and night. Essential services were collapsing. The harbour district suffered particularly heavy bombing as the Japanese targeted shipping and port facilities. Fires burned unchecked through warehouses filled with rubber, tin, and other strategic materials. The water around damaged wharves was slick with spilled fuel oil. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, the convoy codenamed Westward approached Singapore. 23 transport and cargo vessels carrying Australian troops of the 8th Division, along with critical ammunition and medical supplies, needed safe passage into the harbour, and the evacuees they would carry out needed protection during their departure. Previous convoys had suffered losses of up to 60%. Using standard protocols, intelligence estimates predicted Westward might lose 15 vessels, along with their irreplaceable human cargo. Such losses would not only represent a military disaster, but might well trigger the complete collapse of Singapore's defences. As Lieutenant Commander Thornhill studied the maritime charts in his office on the evening of February 2nd, the weight of what was coming pressed upon him with unbearable force. The Japanese held complete air superiority, conventional defences had failed repeatedly, and yet thousands of lives depended on finding a solution that standard military doctrine had not provided. By February 3rd, 1942, the situation in Singapore had deteriorated beyond what most military planners had ever imagined possible. The impregnable fortress was revealing fatal weaknesses by the hour. Lieutenant Commander Percival Thornhill had slept barely 3 hours in the past 2 days, dividing his time between harbour defence coordination and desperate attempts to develop alternative protection strategies for incoming convoys. The pre-dawn briefing that morning had brought only bad news. Weather reports indicated clear skies, perfect bombing conditions. Reconnaissance flights reported 2 Japanese aircraft carriers positioned northwest of Singapore in the Malacca Strait. Radar stations, though still operational, were tracking increased air activity from Japanese-held airfields in Johor. Convoy Westward will enter the eastern approaches at approximately 0800 hours, announced Captain Hargraves, the naval liaison officer. Standard dispersal protocol will be implemented if air attack commences. Smoke screens from shore batteries will provide limited concealment for the inner harbour only. Thornhill, seated at the back of the briefing room, studied the harbour chart spread before him. The standard approach would bring the 23 vessels of Convoy Westward through the deeper eastern channel, making them visible to Japanese observation posts on the mainland for nearly 14 nautical miles. The most dangerous segment, where the channel narrowed near Changi, would expose them for approximately 45 minutes. Previous experience showed Japanese air attacks typically began within 20 minutes of ships being spotted. "With respect, sir," Thornhill spoke up, his voice cutting through the murmur of discussion. "Standard dispersal hasn't worked for the last 3 convoys. The Japanese anticipate it. They target isolated vessels systematically." Captain Hargraves frowned. "The Admiralty protocol is clear, Commander. Concentrated ships present concentrated targets, and scattered ships present scattered targets that can't defend each other," Thornhill countered, rising to his feet. "Permission to propose an alternative approach." The room fell silent. Hargraves hesitated, then nodded curtly. "We are running short of alternatives, Commander. Proceed." Thornhill moved to the large harbour chart at the front of the room. "The Japanese expect us to use the eastern approach because it's deeper and standard for vessels of this draft. They have observation posts here, here, and here." He indicated 3 positions on the mainland shore. "Their aircraft approach from these directions using the morning sun for concealment." He traced a different line on the chart, a narrow, winding channel through the western side of the harbour approach. The western channel is shallower and rarely used for military convoys, but with current tide conditions, it would be navigable for all but the 2 deepest draft vessels in westward. Those 2 could use the standard approach as a diversion. "That's still splitting our defences," objected a Royal Artillery major, "and the western approach is even more exposed to observation from the mainland." "Not if we change the timing and the visibility conditions," Thornhill said quietly. He pointed to a cluster of islands near the western approach. "For the past month, I've been documenting the effect of tide patterns on the morning fog banks that form around these islands. There's a predictable pattern. When the tide shifts at approximately 0630 hours, the temperature differential creates a dense fog bank that drifts eastward for about 90 minutes. Captain Hargraves leaned forward, studying the chart with new interest. "Natural concealment." "Yes, sir, but not sufficient by itself," Thornhill continued. "I've also been working with the harbour tugboat fleet on an additional concealment measure. We've modified the coal-burning tugs to produce thick, persistent smoke when fed with a mixture of coal, heavy oil, and rubber scrap." "Harbour smoke screens have been tried before," the artillery major interjected. "They disperse too quickly in the prevailing winds." "Not when combined with the unique tidal conditions of the western approach," Thornhill countered. He pulled out a small notebook filled with diagrams and calculations. "The morning tide creates a counter-current that circulates between these 3 islands. When smoke is released at these 7 points," he indicated positions on the chart, "it creates a rotating pattern that can maintain density for up to 2 hours, what local fishermen call a smoke tide." "Ah, it's a phenomenon I've observed for years, but never had reason to weaponize until now." The room had grown completely silent as officers studied the chart with new attention. Captain Hargraves broke the silence. "You're proposing to bring 21 vessels through an unfamiliar, shallower channel under the cover of an experimental smokescreen, while using our 2 largest transports as decoys in the main channel?" "Yes, sir. The Japanese will expect us to use the eastern approach. They'll expect us to disperse upon attack. We do neither. Instead, we concentrate our most valuable transports in the western approach under complete concealment, while presenting a convincing but minimal target in the east." "The risk of running aground in the western channel," began the artillery major. "Is my responsibility," Thornhill interrupted. "I'll personally lead the pilot vessels. I've navigated that channel in 0 visibility conditions dozens of times." "And the 2 vessels used as decoys?" asked Hargraves. "The Cornwall and the Duchess," Thornhill replied without hesitation. "Both are older cargo vessels already heavily damaged. They can be fitted with enhanced anti-aircraft batteries and smoke generators of their own. Their mission would be to draw attention, then create their own concealment once attacked." Captain Hargraves studied Thornhill's face for a long moment. "This plan violates at least 7 Admiralty protocols for convoy management." "Yes, sir. It requires precise timing with uncertain weather conditions." "Yes, sir. It places 23 vessels under the guidance of a single harbour pilot." "I'll need 6 additional pilots, sir. I've already identified them, all volunteers with experience in the western channels." Hargraves looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other officers present. No one spoke. The desperate nature of their situation hung in the air like the smoke Thornhill proposed to use. "The convoy is 3 hours out," Hargraves said finally. "You have 90 minutes to prepare your pilot boats and smoke vessels. I'll arrange for the Cornwall and Duchess to proceed as decoys. If this fails, Commander Thornhill, you understand the consequences." It wasn't a question. "I do, sir," Thornhill replied quietly, "and I understand the consequences if we do nothing new." As the briefing dispersed, Lieutenant Rajan Singh, a young Indian naval officer who served as Thornhill's assistant, approached him. "The harbour master will report this to Naval Command," Singh said in a low voice. "You're risking your career." Thornhill was already gathering his charts. "There are 4,000 men on those transports, Lieutenant. Many of them wounded from the Malaya fighting. What's one career against that?" "The Japanese have spotter planes that fly above the fog level," Singh continued, following Thornhill toward the door. "Even if your smoke tide works, they might see through it." "They might," Thornhill acknowledged. "That's why I need your help with one more modification to the plan." As they hurried toward the harbour master's launch, Thornhill explained the final element of his strategy, a deception so audacious that Singh stopped walking for a moment, staring at his superior in disbelief. "That's not bending the rules, sir," he said finally. "That's breaking them completely." Thornhill's weathered face showed no hesitation. "Sometimes, Lieutenant, rules are what the enemy expects us to follow, and sometimes that expectation is their greatest weakness." With less than 2 hours until Convoy Westward's arrival, Thornhill and his team raced against time to implement a plan that would either save thousands of lives or end in catastrophic failure. The fate of 23 ships, and perhaps of Singapore itself, now rested on one harbour pilot's intimate knowledge of tide, smoke, and deception. The harbour district bustled with frantic activity as Lieutenant Commander Thornhill's plan lurched into motion. 7 harbour tugs, their coal furnaces stoked to capacity, were being modified according to his specifications. Boiler crews worked frantically to adjust fuel mixtures, while deckhands secured metal drums filled with a noxious combination of heavy bunker oil, scrap rubber, and tar salvaged from the damaged wharves. "The smoke needs to be black and thick," Thornhill instructed the chief engineer of the lead tug, Resolute, "but controlled. Release too much too quickly, and it dissipates. Too slowly, and we won't get coverage in time." Chief Engineer Wallace McKinnon, a Scotsman who had served in Singapore Harbour for 18 years, nodded grimly. "We've rigged modified spray nozzles to the exhaust stacks. The oil-rubber mixture atomizes in the heat, creating smoke particles that hang lower and disperse more slowly." Thornhill checked his watch, 37 minutes until the convoy's expected arrival. "Position your vessels according to the diagram. Remember, we need to establish the smoke pattern 15 minutes before the convoy arrives, allowing it to settle into the tidal current." At the harbour pilot station, Lieutenant Singh was briefing the 6 additional pilots who would guide the incoming transports. These men, a mixed group of British, Malayan, and Chinese maritime veterans, listened intently as Singh explained the radical departure from standard procedure. Each pilot vessel will be equipped with a special compass housing and marine radio modified to operate on low frequency, Singh explained. Convoy vessels will maintain a distance of 200 yards between ships, following in line astern. Navigation will be entirely by compass bearing and timed turns, not visual references. Pilot Wong Lee Kwan, a 50-year-old Singaporean with 30 years' experience, raised a practical concern. In zero visibility, how do we prevent collisions if a vessel ahead slows unexpectedly? Each pilot boat will carry 2 signalmen with specialized equipment, Singh replied, indicating metal drums with hand-cranked sirens attached. "We've established a simple pattern of signals, 1 long blast for maintain course, 2 short for slight adjustment, 3 rapid for emergency stop. It's crude but effective." As preparations continued, Thornhill made his way to the harbour's eastern observation post, where he could monitor both approaches. From this elevated position, he could see the first signs of the morning fog bank forming around the western islands, exactly as he had predicted. The tidal countercurrent was beginning to circulate between the 3 main islands, creating a slowly rotating mass of water that would trap and hold the artificial smokescreen once it was generated. His radio crackled with an update from the naval liaison officer. Convoy westward has altered course as instructed. The Cornwall and Duchess are proceeding to the Eastern Channel. Remaining 21 vessels approaching Western Islands. First ships estimated to arrive in 29 minutes. Acknowledged, Thornhill replied. Begin smoke generation protocol. Across the Western Harbour approach, the 7 tugboats moved into their designated positions. At Thornhill's signal, they began releasing thick plumes of black smoke that poured from their modified stacks. The dense oily clouds billowed outward, immediately caught by the circulating tide current. As predicted, instead of dissipating, the smoke began to rotate slowly between the islands, building in density and spreading across the water's surface like a living thing. On the bridge of the transport ship, Dorsetshire, Captain James Holloway watched this developing phenomenon with professional interest and personal concern. His vessel carried 300 wounded Australian soldiers evacuated from the Malayan fighting, along with critical medical personnel. As the designated lead ship for the Western approach, the responsibility for following this unorthodox plan weighed heavily. "Visibility dropping rapidly, sir," reported his first officer. "The smoke screen appears to be rotating." "Exactly as described in our briefing," Holloway replied, studying the approaching wall of black smoke through his binoculars. "Prepare to reduce speed to 7 knots. Pilot vessel should be approaching our position shortly." Behind the Dorsetshire, 20 other transport and cargo vessels maintained their tight formation, each captain having been briefed on the unorthodox approach only hours earlier. Many had expressed skepticism, but faced with the devastating losses of previous convoys, all had agreed to follow Thornhill's plan. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Channel, the Cornwall and Duchess proceeded conspicuously toward Singapore Harbour, deliberately maintaining high visibility. Both vessels had been stripped of non-essential personnel, but equipped with enhanced anti-aircraft batteries and their own smoke generators. Their mission was simple but dangerous: draw Japanese attention, then create enough confusion to cover their own escape once the main convoy was safely through the Western Channel. At precisely 07:35, Lieutenant Rajan Singh's voice came through the radio on Thornhill's command post. "First pilot vessel has made contact with Dorsetshire, entering smokescreen perimeter now. Visibility 0. Thornhill acknowledged, then turned to the naval liaison officer beside him. "Now we implement the final element, commence radio deception." This was the most audacious aspect of Thornhill's plan. For the next hour, a series of scripted radio transmissions would be broadcast on frequencies known to be monitored by Japanese intelligence. These transmissions, exchanged between fictional ship captains and escort vessels, would create the impression of a convoy following standard dispersal protocol in the Eastern Channel, complete with panicked reports of air attacks and damage. "Breaking protocol completely," murmured Captain Hargraves, who had arrived to observe the operation. "Creating false military communications is exactly what the Japanese won't expect," Thornhill finished for him. "Their intelligence officers are listening. They're expecting standard procedure and predictable responses." The deception began immediately. Radio operators broadcast convincing exchanges describing a convoy under attack, vessels dispersing according to protocol, and damage reports from ships that didn't exist. The theatrical performance was designed to mask the real convoy's silent passage through the Western Channel. Lieutenant Singh's voice came through again, tense but controlled. "Dorsetshire has entered full smoke coverage. Visibility 0. Navigation proceeding by compass bearing and timing only." For the next 47 minutes, Thornhill stood at the observation post, outwardly calm, but internally calculating each vessel's likely position based on speed and the predetermined route. The artificial smoke tide had now completely engulfed the western approach, creating an impenetrable black wall that extended for nearly 3 nautical miles. From Japanese observation posts on the mainland, it would appear as nothing more extraordinary than one of Singapore's notorious industrial fire events. The burning rubber warehouses had been creating similar smoke clouds for days. At 0812, radar operators reported the first Japanese aircraft approaching from the north, 12 bombers with fighter escort, heading directly for the Eastern Channel, where the Cornwall and Duchess were executing their decoy mission. Right on schedule, Thornhill noted, checking his watch. They're taking the bait. The Japanese aircraft descended toward the two decoy vessels, which immediately began their own defensive measures, deploying smoke screens and executing evasive maneuvers while maintaining their position in the Eastern Channel. Anti-aircraft batteries on both ships opened fire, creating a convincing display of resistance. Meanwhile, in the pitch-black heart of the smoke tide, the main convoy continued its careful navigation through the Western Channel. The pilot boats led each vessel through a precise sequence of course adjustments, timed to avoid the shallower sections of the channel. The ships moved in complete radio silence, relying entirely on the pre-arranged signal system and the skill of the harbour pilots. On the bridge of the Dorsetshire, Captain Holloway could see absolutely nothing beyond the windows. The world had been reduced to instrument readings and the occasional muffled signal blast from the pilot boat ahead. "This is madness," muttered his first officer, straining to see anything through the impenetrable blackness. "We could run aground at any moment." "Trust the pilot," Holloway replied, though his knuckles were white on the bridge railing. "Thornhill knows these waters better than anyone." At 0841, Lieutenant Singh's voice broke the tension with an update. "Dorsetshire has cleared the Channel Narrows, entering final approach to Harbour West. One by one, the vessels of Convoy westward emerged from the smoke tide into the relative clarity of Singapore's inner harbour. As they emerged, each ship was immediately directed to predetermined berths by waiting harbour craft, maintaining the deception until all 21 vessels were safely docked. At 0915, the final transport cleared the smokescreen and reached safe harbour. In the Eastern Channel, the Cornwall and Duchess had successfully executed their own escape after drawing Japanese air attacks away from the main convoy. The Cornwall had suffered moderate damage from near misses, while the Duchess reported only minor injuries to crew members. As Thornhill watched the last vessel dock safely, Captain Hargraves approached him with an unreadable expression. 23 ships arrived. 23 ships safe," Hargraves stated flatly. "Not a single vessel lost, not one casualty." He paused, then added, "Your smoke tide worked precisely as you predicted." Thornhill nodded, the exhaustion of the past 48 hours suddenly catching up with him. "The tide and current patterns are consistent this time of year. It was simply a matter of using what nature already provided. And the radio deception, the falsified communications, the deliberate violation of dispersal protocol," Hargraves pressed. "Also effective," Thornhill replied without apology. "Sometimes the rules must adapt to the reality of the situation." Hargraves was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "The convoy is carrying reinforcements and supplies that might extend our defense by weeks. You've given Singapore a chance, Commander." He hesitated, then added, "General Percival has requested your presence at Fort Canning this afternoon. I believe he wants to discuss applying your method to future convoys." As the captain walked away, Lieutenant Singh approached with a message form in hand. "Sir, we've received confirmation that all vessels are secure. Unloading of critical supplies has begun." He hesitated, then added, "There's something else. The Japanese radio frequencies have gone silent. It appears they believe they damaged or sank several vessels in the Eastern Channel." Thornhill allowed himself a small smile. "Then we've gained something beyond just this convoy. We've created doubt in their intelligence assessment. Next time, they won't know which channel is real and which is deception." Singh glanced at the harbour, where thousands of troops were now disembarking from the safely docked transports. 4,000 men, who would likely be dead or captured, he said quietly. "All because you chose to break the rules." "Not break them," Thornhill corrected, looking out at the dissipating smoke tide that had saved so many lives. "Adapt them to the reality of the waters we're navigating." What neither man knew then was that this improvised tactic, born of desperation and intimate knowledge of local conditions, would soon become standard procedure for Allied convoys throughout the South China Sea. The Thornhill method, as it would later be called in classified naval documents, would save thousands more lives before Singapore finally fell to Japanese forces on February 15, 1942. In the immediate aftermath of Convoy Westward's successful arrival, Lieutenant Commander Thornhill found himself in an unexpected position. Rather than facing disciplinary action for violating established protocols, he was summoned to an emergency meeting at Fort Canning, Singapore's military headquarters. The atmosphere in the underground command center was tense but energized. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, overall commander of Commonwealth forces in Singapore, presided over a gathering of senior officers from all service branches. "Commander Thornhill," Percival began, his gaunt face showing the strain of recent weeks, "Captain Hargraves informs me that your unconventional approach resulted in 0 losses for this morning's convoy. That's unprecedented in our current circumstances." Thornhill stood at attention. "Yes, sir. The combination of natural tidal patterns and artificial smoke generation proved effective." "And the deceptive radio communications?" General Percival raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant departure from established procedure." "A necessary one, sir," Thornhill replied without hesitation. "The Japanese have been anticipating our standard responses. Changing the pattern confused their intelligence assessment." General Percival exchanged glances with Air Vice Marshal Conway Pulford, commander of RAF forces in Singapore. "Our reconnaissance flights report Japanese bomber squadrons continuing to patrol the eastern approach. They appear to believe they damaged several vessels there." "The deception worked better than anticipated then," Thornhill noted. "Indeed." General Percival leaned forward. "Commander, I want this method implemented for all remaining convoys, both inbound and outbound. We have thousands of civilians waiting for evacuation and critical military personnel who must be extracted before—" He stopped abruptly. The unspoken reality hung in the air. Singapore's fall was now considered inevitable by most senior commanders. The question was no longer if, but when, and how many could be saved before the end. "I'll need additional resources," Thornhill said, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "More tugboats modified for smoke generation, training for additional harbour pilots, and authority to implement similar deception measures without seeking approval for each convoy." General Percival nodded. "You'll have it. Colonel Simmons will provide whatever you require." He paused, then added, "Time is not on our side, Commander. How quickly can you implement this for the next scheduled evacuation?" "The Devonshire convoy is scheduled to depart in 36 hours, Thornhill replied. "We'll be ready." Over the next 2 weeks, the final 2 weeks of British Singapore, Thornhill's smoke tide method was implemented for 17 additional convoys. Each operation built upon lessons learned from previous attempts. The tidal patterns were mapped with increasing precision. The smoke generation techniques were refined to create denser, more persistent coverage. Navigation methods for zero visibility conditions were standardized and taught to dozens of additional pilots. The results were remarkable. Of 23 convoys that utilized the Thornhill method between February 3rd and February 14th, 19 passed without a single vessel lost. The remaining 4 suffered only minimal casualties, far below what conventional tactics had previously experienced. More than 30,000 civilians and 7,000 military personnel were safely evacuated during this period. Critical documents, specialized equipment, and wounded soldiers were prioritized for extraction. Each successful convoy strengthened the technique, as pilots became more confident, navigating by compass bearing and timing alone. The Japanese, meanwhile, became increasingly frustrated by their inability to intercept these phantom convoys, as they called them. Their aerial reconnaissance reported smoke clouds that seemed to materialize and disappear with the tides. Their intelligence intercepted radio communications that led bombing raids to empty stretches of water. The confusion created by Thornhill's deception tactics spread through Japanese command structures, leading to misallocation of resources and heightened paranoia. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, reportedly demanded answers from his air staff about the British smoke ships that seemed to appear and disappear at will. Japanese pilots began to report sightings of vessels that weren't there, ghost ships emerging briefly from smoke banks, only to vanish again. As Singapore's defences crumbled on land, the maritime evacuation routes remained remarkably secure. Thornhill worked around the clock, personally leading many of the most critical convoys through the smoke tide. His intimate knowledge of local waters, knowledge that couldn't be found in any naval manual or chart, proved more valuable than conventional military doctrine. On February 12th, as Japanese forces crossed the Johor Strait and established beachheads on Singapore Island itself, Thornhill received an unexpected visitor at the Harbour Master's office. Admiral Sir Geoffrey Leighton, Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Fleet, had arrived to oversee the final evacuation of key personnel. "Commander Thornhill," the Admiral said without preamble, "I've reviewed the reports of your smoke-tide operations. 23 convoys, over 300 vessels safely guided, minimal losses. It's the one bright spot in an otherwise disastrous campaign." Thornhill, exhausted from 72 hours without proper sleep, acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "I've authorized implementation of your methods throughout the South China Sea Theatre," Admiral Leighton continued. "Naval intelligence is classifying the specific techniques, of course, but the concept is being adapted for convoy operations from Rangoon to Batavia. The method requires intimate knowledge of local tide conditions," Thornhill cautioned. "It can't simply be transplanted without—" "Which is why you're being reassigned," the Admiral interrupted. "You'll depart on tomorrow's command convoy to establish similar operations in Java. We can't afford to lose your expertise if Singapore falls." Thornhill stiffened. "With respect, sir, there are still thousands awaiting evacuation here. My pilots and I have developed the system for these specific waters. Your primary assistant, Lieutenant Singh, is it, has demonstrated sufficient mastery to continue operations here," Admiral Leighton replied firmly. "Meanwhile, Allied shipping throughout the region is suffering catastrophic losses. Your expertise is needed elsewhere." Thornhill wanted to protest further, but recognized the military logic. Singapore was lost. The knowledge he had developed might save many more lives if implemented across the broader theatre. "Very well, Admiral. I'll prepare for transfer." "There's one more thing," Admiral Leighton added, reaching into his briefcase. "This arrived by special courier from London yesterday." He handed Thornhill an official document bearing the Admiralty seal. "A field promotion to commander, effective immediately, and this." The second document was a citation for the Distinguished Service Order, signed by the First Sea Lord himself. Thornhill stared at the papers in surprise. "I broke protocol. Sir Hughes violated standing orders regarding convoy management." Admiral Leighton's expression remained stern, but his eyes showed a glimmer of understanding. The citation reads, "For exceptional innovation in maritime operations under enemy action." "Sometimes, Commander Thornhill, the most valuable service is knowing precisely which protocols to ignore, and having the courage to do so." On February 13, 1942, Commander Percival Thornhill departed Singapore aboard the light cruiser HMS Durban, carrying with him detailed documentation of the smoke-tide method. Lieutenant Rajan Singh remained behind to oversee the final evacuation convoys before the surrender. Singapore fell to Japanese forces on February 15th. Lieutenant Singh was captured during the final evacuation attempt and spent the remainder of the war in a Japanese prisoner camp. He survived to provide testimony about the smoke-tide operations during post-war historical documentation. Thornhill's method was implemented with varying degrees of success throughout the South China Sea and eventually in the Mediterranean theatre. The technique was most effective in areas with similar tidal conditions to Singapore Harbour, particularly in the island chains of Indonesia and the Philippines. After the war, Thornhill's innovation received little public recognition. The details remained classified until 1967, when partial records were released as part of a broader declassification of World War II naval operations. Even then, the full extent of the smoke-tide's effectiveness was downplayed in official histories, perhaps because it represented such a stark departure from established doctrine. Thornhill himself returned to Singapore in 1946, resuming his role as a senior harbour pilot for the rebuilt port facilities. He rarely spoke about his wartime innovations, preferring to focus on rebuilding the maritime infrastructure that had been so thoroughly destroyed during the Japanese occupation. When interviewed for an official naval history in 1962, Thornhill summed up his approach with characteristic understatement. "The water teaches you its patterns if you watch long enough. The regulations are written by men who've never seen this particular stretch of sea, this particular tide, this particular moment. Sometimes you must trust the water more than the rule book." The true legacy of Thornhill's smoke-tide extended beyond the vessels saved or the lives preserved. It demonstrated how local knowledge, intimate familiarity with specific conditions that couldn't be captured in standardized procedures, could prove decisive in warfare. It showed the value of adaptive innovation over rigid adherence to established doctrine. In 1971, nearly 30 years after those desperate days in Singapore Harbour, a naval training facility in Portsmouth, England, established the Thornhill simulation, a complex exercise that deliberately presented naval officers with scenarios where standard protocols would lead to failure. The exercise forced participants to innovate using only the resources and knowledge immediately available to them. The instructors at this facility often began the exercise with a quote attributed to Commander Thornhill: "The enemy expects you to follow your own rulebook. Sometimes victory lies in the gap between what the rules prescribe and what the water allows." For the thousands who escaped Singapore in those final days, who lived full lives, had families, and contributed to the post-war world because of one harbour pilot's intimate knowledge of tide and smoke, Thornhill's legacy needed no official recognition. Their very existence was testament enough to the power of adaptive thinking in the face of seemingly impossible odds. In his quiet retirement in Singapore, Thornhill received occasional letters from former evacuees or their families. One such letter, from an Australian nurse who had escaped on one of the final convoys, perhaps best captured the human impact of his innovation. "I don't pretend to understand how your smoke tide worked," she wrote. "All I remember is the blackness outside the ship, the strange sense of moving through nothing, and the terrifying waiting. Then suddenly emerging into Singapore Harbour, safe, when we had been certain we would die that day. 43 years later, I have 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and a lifetime of service as a nurse. None of it would have existed without your smoke. We sailed through darkness into life itself." In his reply, Thornhill wrote only, "The tide was with us that day. I merely read what it was telling me." When Percival Thornhill died in 1981 at the age of 84, his obituary in the Singapore Straits Times mentioned his long service as a harbour pilot and his wartime naval rank, but made no reference to the smoke tide operations. The classified nature of those desperate innovations had kept them from public knowledge for so long that they had faded even from military memory. Yet in naval archives, in classified documents, and in the living testimony of those who survived, the story remained. A testament to how one person's intimate knowledge of natural patterns, combined with the courage to defy standard procedure, created a path to safety where none seemed possible. In warfare, as in navigation, the most valuable knowledge is often not found in manuals or regulations, but in the accumulated wisdom of those who have studied the specific waters they travel. When Lieutenant Commander Percival Thornhill chose to trust the patterns of tide and current he had observed for decades over the standardized protocols of distant planners, he demonstrated a truth that extends beyond military operations. Sometimes the most powerful innovations come not from breaking the rules, but from truly understanding the natural world those rules attempt to govern. Would you have broken protocol as Thornhill did, risking your career and possibly court-martial to implement an untested method? Or would you have followed established procedure, knowing its likely fatal consequences? The answer reveals much about how we balance discipline against innovation, protocol against adaptation in our own lives and decisions. Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means, not just the physical bravery of facing enemy fire, but the moral courage to defy established wisdom when lives hang in the balance.